Poetry on the SAT. If you clicked on this video, you probably know what I'm talking about, and you probably hate it with a fiery passion. And I get it. Poetry can feel like a secret code that's deliberately hard to crack. But relax, I've got you covered. In this video, we're going to discuss 3 tricks that you can use to read and understand poetry more effectively. And then we're going to apply that knowledge in solving specific questions like the ones you'll encounter on the real SAT. Just give me about 20 minutes of your time. I promise that the next time you encounter a poetry question on the SAT, you will be able to answer it quickly, confidently, and best of all, correctly. Part 1. How to understand poetry. So the SAT tests poetry in a lot of different ways. It could ask you to find the main idea of a poem or a particular detail. It could ask you about the purpose of an entire poem or just the purpose of a specific line. It could ask you to break down the structure of a poem. And it could even ask you to use lines of a poem as evidence to support a claim. We'll discuss specific ways to approach each question type a little bit later on. But regardless of the question type, you'll need a basic ability to read and understand poetry. And to develop that, it helps to begin by thinking about what makes poetry so hard in the first place. Now, one of the reasons that poetry can be hard to understand is vocab. A lot of poems use old words that aren't very common in modern English, or even worse, that have changed meanings over time. Let me show you an example. This one's an excerpt from the poem Sonnet 16 by John Birkin. Thou art more fair than blossoms newly sprung, whose scent hath fled ere yet their song be sung. Like seriously, what's that even supposed to mean? But if you know that thou means you, and art means are, and fair means beautiful, and hath means has, and ere means before, well, suddenly it's not so bad. If you didn't know most of those words though, don't panic. I've got a resource that can help. It's a list of older words that come up often in poetry, and you can download it for free on my website, ivyleaguementorsprep.com. I'll leave a link in the comments. Now, the second reason that poetry can be hard to understand is that it includes a lot of stylistic elements like simile, metaphor, and symbolism. Again, let's check out a short poem illustrating that. This one's called The Lantern by Grant B. Greenhain. A lantern swings on a wind-worn trail. Its flame is small and often pale. It flickers near a stream so wide, but never falls though shadows bide. Some walk by and never see. The light was meant to set them free. So on the surface, this poem is about a lantern on a trail, and some people who walk by that lantern without even noticing it. But light is a common symbol of knowledge or truth, and a trail is often a symbol of one's progression through life. So if you read it with that in mind, maybe the poem is suggesting that a lot of people go through life trapped by their own ignorance. Now, if you're struggling to find the deeper meaning of poems, I've got another resource that can help you. It's a list of common symbols in poetry and what they usually represent. And this one's on my website too. Again, I'll leave a link for it in the comments. Now, a third reason that poetry can be difficult to understand is because of the way that it's formatted. As a reader, you're probably used to breaking whatever you're reading into sentences. But a lot of poems are broken not into sentences, but into lines. And those lines may not always come at logical stopping points. This is especially true in modern poems, which can make them feel really disorienting. If you see a poem where the line breaks just don't seem to make sense, my advice to you would be to ignore them completely, and to instead use punctuation and context clues to determine the flow. Let's check out another example. This one is an excerpt from the poem Witness by Isabella John, in which the speaker reflects on a moment watching her father change a tire. Let's read it the way you might be tempted to do it, pausing at every line. He kneels, in gravel, his knee hinge. That now sticks, hands, the same ones, pulling at the rusted bolt, as if memory were torque. Now, as you can see, when you read a poem like this, like that, it can be really hard to find the flow. It's just so choppy. So let's try reading it again and doing that trick where instead we use punctuation and context clues to help us determine the flow. He kneels in gravel, his knee a hinge that now sticks, hands, the same ones, pulling at the rusted bolt, as if memory were torque. Now, it still may not be entirely clear what the poet means, but at least that's a lot more natural in terms of the flow. It feels like we're reading something intelligible, rather than just random words thrown onto a page. So now that we've covered a few basic tips about how to approach poetry in general, it's time to address how poetry is covered on the SAT. Part 2. Poetry on the SAT. So as I was saying before, poetry on the SAT can be tested in a lot of different ways. And in this part of the video, we're going to look at all the different ways poetry can be tested on the SAT and discuss how to approach it effectively in each of them. The first place you'll see poetry come up on the SAT is in central idea questions. Let's take a look at an example so you can see what I'm talking about. Which choice best states the main idea of the text? So let's read the poem together with that in mind, trying to just focus on the big picture for a moment. I wish I could remember that first day, first hour, first moment of your meeting me. If bright or dim the season, it might be summer or winter, for all I can say. So unrecorded did it slip away. So blind was I to see and to foresee. So dull to mark the budding of my tree, that would not blossom yet for many a May. So this poem is not exactly easy, but let's break it down and try to establish a few things. First, it's clear that the speaker is addressing another person, you. And she seems to be saying that she wishes she could remember when she and that person first met. But she can't. The memory was unrecorded and slipped away. And now she feels bad about that. Now that we've established that, we can look through our answer choices one by one and try to find a match, starting with A. The speaker celebrates how the passage of time has strengthened a relationship that once seemed unimportant. Now this one is tempting because the poem does talk about a relationship that once seemed important to the speaker. But is the poem celebrating the passage of time? If anything, the speaker seems kinda regretful that she doesn't remember when she and this other person first met. So the tone is kinda sad rather than celebratory. I think that's enough for us to cross off answer A and move on to B. Because the speaker did not anticipate how important a relationship would become, she cannot recall how the relationship began, which she regrets. Now this is an answer that matches our prediction almost perfectly. It includes the idea that the speaker doesn't remember her first encounter with this person, and it also includes the element that she feels bad about it. She wishes she could remember that moment. Therefore, we can pick answer B with confidence and move on to the next question. So let's talk about the next way you might encounter poetry on the digital SAT. I'm talking about a detail question. Let's take a look at an example of one of them together. Based on the text, in what way is the human mind like a flower? Now the key thing to realize when you get a question like this is that you don't need to understand the entire poem. You just need to figure out how, according to the poem, the human mind is like a flower. So let's read the poem with that in mind, and let's not allow ourselves to become distracted by anything else that isn't related to that point. As a fragile and lovely flower unfolds its gleaming foliage on the breast of the fostering earth, if the dew and rain draw it forth, so doth my tender mind flourish, if it be fed with the sweet dew of the fostering spirit. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop right there, because as we were saying, we don't need to understand the whole poem, we just need to focus on the question. And the poem has already given us enough to answer that question. It's already presented one way in which the human mind is like a flower. It tells us that just as a flower unfolds its gleaming foliage, which is fancy for grows well, if the dew and rain draw it forth, or make it grow, so doth, and if you've downloaded that handout on poetry vocabulary that I was talking about, you'll know that doth means do or does. So does the mind flourish, which again is fancy speak for grows well, if it's fed with the sweet dew of fostering spirit. Now, I doubt the speaker is literally talking about feeding a mind. I mean, that would be kind of weird, right? So it's probably something metaphorical. But the basic idea is the same. The poem seems to be suggesting that a flower will grow well if you give it the right stuff, like water and dew, and that a human mind is the same way. that it will also flourish or grow well if you give it the right stuff, whatever that fostering spirit is supposed to represent. Now that we've established that, let's check out our answer choices one by one and see if we can find a match, starting as usual with A. It becomes increasingly vigorous with the passage of time. Now here's an answer that sounds kind of appealing. Becoming increasingly vigorous sounds a little bit like flourishing or growing well. But we're missing something. The poem doesn't say that a flower or mind necessarily grows well with time. Rather, it only grows well if it's fed well. So that really changes the meaning of the poem, and so I think we can cross off answer A and move on to answer B. It draws strength from changes in the weather. Now this one may seem a little bit closer. Rain is weather, right? And the poem does say that flowers draw their strength from the rain. But is it telling us that flowers draw their strength from changes in weather in general, or more specifically in rain? And furthermore, does the human mind also draw its strength from the weather? Remember, we decided that the sweet dew of the fostering spirit that gives the human mind its strength is probably something metaphorical rather than literal weather. So I think that's enough for us to cross off answer B and instead move on to C. It requires proper nourishment in order to thrive. At last we've found an answer that matches our prediction almost perfectly. Just as the flower needs the nourishment of the rain to grow, so too does the human mind need the nourishment of the sweet dew of fostering spirit, whatever that's supposed to represent, in order to grow. So they both need the right nourishment. That means we can pick answer C with confidence and move on to the next question. So the third kind of question you'll get involving poetry is one that asks you about the overall purpose of a particular poem. Again, let me show you an example. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? So knowing that I'm being asked about the main purpose, I'm probably going to want to read the whole poem. But again, I don't necessarily need to understand every detail. Instead, I'm just going to focus on trying to understand basically what its message is, picking up the general vibe. So let's read it together with that in mind. There shall be new roads wending, a new beating of the drum. Men's eyes shall have fresh seeing, gray lives reprise their span. But under the new sun's being, completing what night began, there'll be the same backs bending, same sad feet shall drum, when this night finds its ending, and day shall have come. Now, one of the things that strikes me immediately about this poem is the contrast. The whole first part about new roads and fresh seeing sounds super positive, but the whole second part about backs bending and sad feet is pretty depressing. And then that last line about the night becoming day suggests the idea of a cycle. So I feel like this poem is trying to convey something about a cycle that includes both positive and negative aspects. With that in mind, it's time to approach the answer choices, starting as usual with A, to consider how the repetitiveness inherent in human life can be both rewarding and challenging. Now here's an answer that looks pretty good. It talks about repetitiveness in life, which fits with our idea of the cycle. And it also talks about how that repetitiveness or cycle can be both rewarding and challenging, which matches our prediction that the cycle includes both positive and negative aspects. Therefore, it seems like we've gotten lucky and stumbled upon the correct answer on the first try. Now, if you have plenty of time, it's not a bad idea to go through the other answer choices just to confirm your answer. But since I'm feeling pretty confident, I'm going to go ahead and say that A is the correct answer, and we're going to go and move on to the next question. But before we move on to the next question, a quick public service announcement. I made a textbook, Digital SAT Reading and Writing, the Ultimate Guide. Now, I may be a tiny bit biased, but I'm pretty confident it's the best resource out there for anybody who's looking to master reading and writing on the SAT. It's got guides on all the question types and text types, including poetry, along with a bunch of practice questions that you can use to drill them in. It also has resources on grammar, vocab, and more, not to mention realistic full-length practice modules that you can use to assess and improve your skills. If you want to pick up a copy, I'll leave a link in the description, along with a promo code that you can use to get 25% off your purchase. Now back to the video. So the fourth type of question you'll encounter will ask you about the purpose not of an entire poem, but of a specific line or section within a poem. Again, let's take a look at an example together. Which choice best describes the function of the underlined portion in the text as a whole? Now, when you see a question like this, you might feel tempted just to read the underlined part. But if you do that, you're probably going to miss out on important context. So instead, what I would do with a question like this is to start reading at the beginning and to read through and maybe a little bit beyond the underlined part. And when I'm doing that, I'm going to be thinking about what this underlined part is doing within the poem as a whole. Let's try that together right now. O deep delight to watch the gladsome waves, exultant leap upon the rugged rocks, ever repulsed yet ever rushing on, filled with a life that will not know defeat, to see the glorious hues of sky and sea. So I'm going to stop right here. It's possible that I'll need to read more, but it's also possible that I won't. So first I'd like to stop and reflect for just a moment on what this underlined part is doing within the part of the poem that we've read so far. Now the line is describing the waves, and it's describing them almost as if they're humans, saying that they refuse to be defeated. Even if they're repulsed, they keep rushing on. I think that's going to be enough to answer the question. So let's take a look at the answer choices and see if we can find a match. Starting as usual with A. It portrays the surroundings as an imposing and intimidating scene. So the line is indeed portraying the surroundings, the waves, but not as imposing and intimidating. In fact, the speaker is pretty positive about the waves and even says it's a delight to watch them. So I think we can cross off answer A and move on to B. It characterizes the sea's waves as a relentless and enduring force. Now this answer is also about the waves, which is good, and better yet, it talks about them being relentless and enduring, which fits well with our prediction that they don't give up, they keep rushing on. So we should be able to pick answer B with confidence and move on to the next question. So the fifth type of question you'll get regarding poetry on the SAT asks you to determine the structure of a poem. As usual, let's begin by checking out an example together. Which choice best describes the overall structure of the text? Now, when I see a question like this, I know for sure that I'm going to have to read the whole poem, because the correct answer is probably going to relate to both the beginning and the end of the poem. But I don't necessarily need to understand every detail. Instead, as I read, I'm going to think about how the different parts of the poem work together to try to establish the structure. So let's try that together. I have just seen a most beautiful thing, slim and still against a gold sky. A straight black cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger pointing upwards. Why, beautiful still finger, are you black? And why are you pointing upwards? So in the first part of the poem, the speaker is describing a cypress, a kind of tree, and it seems to be standing against a golden sky, and she thinks it looks a little bit like a black finger. And in the second part of the poem, she seems to be asking some questions about what that tree is supposed to mean. Now that we've established that, it's time to check out our answers, starting as always with A. The speaker assesses a natural phenomenon, then questions the accuracy of her assessment. So I guess we could call a tree standing against a golden sky a natural phenomenon, although I feel like the speaker is describing it more than assessing it. Moreover, while the second part does involve questions, I don't feel like the speaker is questioning her assessment. Rather, she seems to be wondering what exactly this tree against the golden sky is supposed to represent. So given those two issues, I feel like we can cross off answer A and move on to B. The speaker describes a distinctive sight in nature, then ponders what meaning to attribute to that sight. Well, a black tree against a golden sky could be considered a distinctive sight in nature, and the speaker is certainly describing it. Moreover, those questions at the end do seem to be pondering what the sight means, so that part checks out too. It seems we found our answer, and it's B. So there's one last question type we're going to talk about today, and this one is really different from the others. Instead of asking you a question about a poem, this kind of question gives you a claim, and then it asks you to use lines from a poem to support or challenge that claim. Let's check out an example together. Which quotation from Loon Point most effectively illustrates the claim? So when you see a question like this, the first step you'll need to take is to read and understand the claim. Let's do that right now. Loon Point is a 1912 poem by Amy Lowell. In the poem, which presents a nighttime scene on a body of water, Lowell describes an element of nature as an active participant in the experience, writing blank. So the claim is telling us that nature is described as an active participant in the scene, implying that it needs to be doing something, ideally in an active way. So let's read through our answer choices one by one and see if we can find a match. Starting as always with A. Through the water, the moon writes her legends, in light on the smooth, wet sand. So does this line involve nature? Sure. The moon is nature, so is water, so is sand. But is nature doing something actively in this scene? Actually, yeah. I mean, the moon seems to be very involved in the scene. It's not doing nothing, it's writing. And the speaker even refers to the moon as her, which suggests that it's kind of like a character rather than just some thing that exists. So I would say that the moon is very actively involved in the scene, which means, once again, we've stumbled upon the correct answer in our first try. As I said before, if you have plenty of time, it's not a bad idea to read through the other answer choices just to confirm. But because I'm relatively confident, I'm going to pick answer A and move on. Part 3, closing thoughts. So there you have it, 3 tips that you can use to better understand poetry. We've also discussed 6 different ways poetry can be tested on the SAT, and how you can approach poetry effectively in each of these. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have other topics you'd like me to cover in future videos, let me know about that in the comments too. Thanks as always for watching, and good luck on the test.